This project is an analysis of the various ways in which the urban poor in India create and cultivate unused spaces for the benefit of themselves and their community. The specific focus of the study is upon the stretches of citizen-appropriated land along the railway tracks in the Indian cities of Jalandhar, Delhi, and Mumbai. A survey of these spaces and the people who use them reveals much about this unique reclamation. Driven by the increasing scarcity of available public space in urban India, many have reappropriated portions of the railway easements as well as the active tracks themselves. While some of the land is simply claimed by adjacent property owners as an extension of their own property, the space is more commonly used by the lower income residents from adjacent areas for communal farming plots, animal grazing lands, public gathering spaces, open green spaces, and pedestrian corridors. Considering the extreme vehicular congestion in the city streets, the spaces carved through the cities by the railroads have become de facto pedestrian thoroughfares, replete with pushcart and rickshaw-based commerce. The absence of automobile traffic and the relatively appropriate scale of the railway tracks allows this transformation of these open spaces. In most developed countries, railway track right-of-way has become a no-man's land, isolated and uninhabited, but in India, these places are alive and vibrant, informal public spaces with numerous uses. Within the extremely dense built environments of the cities of India, the railway tracks provide rare corridors of open space. These tracks open the space up and provide a valuable cross-section through the urban fabric. In this way, they become thoroughfares and boulevards in their own right. Often they are the quickest means to walk between certain parts of the city, and they are the most direct and often least crowded routes. Usually, people traveling the tracks were using them as a set route, and though it was not uncommon to see babas, also called sadhus or wandering ascetics, who were simply roaming by foot along the train tracks. Both people who live adjacent to the tracks and people from other parts of the city use the tracks as thoroughfares on a daily basis. In Delhi, pedestrian traffic was less common to see. It was the only place that we actually encountered policemen who asked us to please leave the tracks. There is, since it's the national capital, there is always a threat of terrorist attacks, and so there is a lot less pedestrian activity that occurs on Delhi railways. In all three cities, it was interesting to look at the various points of access to determine how people, approach and move through these spaces. We saw everything from giant holes in brick walls to slats removed in fencing to tiny doors leading out of the back of old abandoned buildings. These sorts of access points determine the circulation paths that are used within the cities and along the railway tracks. Informal or slum housing often makes headlines in larger Indian cities for its encroachment on the railway right-of-way. With the extreme scarcity of affordable housing and the prevalence of exorbitant land costs, many are forced to seek informal and illegal housing alternatives.
गुरदेव सिंह दुर्गापुरिया केड़ा मित्रा
In Mumbai, the residents of the right-of-way areas have formed their own specific group, the Railway Slum Dwellers Federation, which works in coordination with NGOs to negotiate with the city regarding services and relocation. Currently in Mumbai, over 60% of the resident population does not have access to formal housing. One of the more common uses along the track right-of-way is urban farming. Typically, these plots are vegetable gardens and small-scale farms. The produce is consumed within the household as well as sold at local markets. In Jalandhar, garden plots are commonly located adjacent to slum housing that is built against the railway tracks. In these cases, the produce is used both for subsistence farming as well as for market sale. Ulpa, or cow dung patties, are often seen laid out in hand-formed discs along the tracks to dry in the sun. They will be used or sold as fertilizer or biofuel for cooking. Cattle can often be found grazing along the tracks. Usually the managed cows are part of small dairy herds. Typically their milk is sold unpasteurized from large milk jugs that hang along the wheel racks of bicycles and motorcycles. In Mumbai, we stumbled across one of several large-scale dairy farms that exist right within the city. Each of these contain 100 to 200 cows, and they exist just along the tracks. The local trains are used to transport the milk to the nearby stations, where it is then further distributed, again through the use of two-wheelers. In Mumbai, the Indian Railway Authority has begun leasing land to its maintenance personnel for small urban farms. This dissuades further encroachment on railway lands by squatters. Especially in Jalandhar, in the middle and upper class areas, the right-of-way has become a space of leisure. With the typical Indian zero-lot line home, very little land is commonly seen given over to yards or non-agricultural garden spaces. And while neighborhoods will often have parks, private or semi-private green spaces are very rare. This has led to the right-of-way being used as a garden space and also as a leisure and recreational space. In each city surveyed, large amounts of garbage could be found along the railway lines. This trail of refuse begins with the train cars themselves. It is common practice for riders to toss rubbish from the moving trains, and the tracks become a repository for all manner of waste. For slum dwellers as well as upper-class residents, the right-of-way is often a local area dumping ground. When houses back up to the right-of-way, trash is usually pitched over the rear wall of the lots. Trash pickers travel along the tracks, sorting through the various garbage in search of recyclable or semi-valuable materials. Occasionally, the trash will be somewhat sorted into types of refuse, and primarily organic refuse piles can become sources of organic fertilizer used on the trackside gardens. The organic dump sites often become areas where stray cows and dogs congregate to feed. In Jalandhar, common commercial activities include furniture fabrication, recycling, and food processing. These all exist alongside the tracks. The rights-of-way, like we've said, serve as pedestrian arteries in certain areas, and small retail stands exist along these portions. They're like mini convenience stores along people's routes. They sell items as varied as tea, snacks, and toiletries. And they are closely arranged around the tracks, one after the other, typically in the middle of long stretches of busy pathways far from roadways crossing the tracks. The goods and materials that are delivered to these stands are done via motorcycles, bicycle rickshaws, push carts, or when access permits, motorized three-wheelers.